I want to talk to you about stories. First of all, the story of this picture. It was taken here on this campus when I was a 15-year-old sophomore and my father came to visit me. You can tell it was the 70s from my afro and from my father's velvet bell-bottom suit. When I saw this photo at my father's funeral service 6 years ago, I couldn't stop staring at it. On the back, his then-girlfriend had written, "Father and son at George School, a happy memory." You see, I had very few happy memories of my father from this period. He and my mother had divorced when I was 6 years old, and she had taken us away from Los Angeles, where he taught political science at UCLA, and we had moved to a small college town in Massachusetts where she got a job teaching French. For 5 years, I barely saw or spoke with my father. Then he moved east as well for a job at Princeton University, but by then he had become an alcoholic. So what I remember mostly from those teen years are visits that ended with his drinking and us fighting and one of us leaving. Eventually my father stopped drinking and we learned to get along better. But the story that I always told about my childhood, to myself, to my wife, to my therapist, was that I had worshiped my father only to have him disappoint me. And if I had grown up to become a responsible husband and parent and not a total screw-up in my own professional life, the story went, it was despite him and not because of him. Then, a year to the day after my father died, I woke up in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, with a sudden urge to try to write a book about our relationship. I got out of bed and I started to type on my laptop. But after a week or so of writing, I realized that I didn't remember or know enough to fill an entire book. So I started to report, to interview my mother and other relatives, friends and colleagues, to search for letters and diaries, and to find out more about the places that my father and his parents had lived. And what I ended up with was a very different story than the one that I had set out to write. It was a family history that spanned 4 generations and traced my father's people back to slavery and the Great Migration and his upbringing as the son of 2 black undertakers in Pittsburgh. That's my granddad, C.S. Whitaker, one of the first black morticians in Pittsburgh, and my grandmother Edith rocking a flapper look in the 1920s. It was also the story of my mother's parents, white Protestant missionaries who had met in French Africa, got married and had 8 daughters, sent 6 of them to the United States for safekeeping during World War II, and while they were away, helped hide hundreds of Jews from the Nazis in the mountains of central France. Those are my maternal grandparents, Edouard and Mildred Tace, in the middle, and this is, on the top left, that's my mom with her 5 sisters on the boat that brought them to New York City in 1940. It was a story of a scandalous interracial romance in the 1950s, and a wrenching divorce, and my father's descent into alcoholism, but one set against the backdrop of all the changes in race relations, feminism, academic culture, and addiction science that took place as those personal dramas unfolded. Most of all, it was a story told not just from my perspective, the poor child of divorce and dysfunction, but also from their perspective. I explored my father's conflicts with his own father, his complicated relationship with his mother, and my mother's loving but overly dutiful bond with her parents. Even after decades of psychiatric self-evaluation, it left me with a far greater understanding and empathy towards my parents than I had ever had, and a deeper level of forgiveness. It also made me realize that I owed far more to my parents and to my grandparents than I had ever acknowledged. When the book was published, people would ask me whether I found writing it therapeutic. I would joke that there should be a new form of therapy devoted to reporting about your family rather than just complaining about them. But then I discovered that, in fact, there has been a lot of research in the last decade into what experts call narrative psychology, the way in which our identity is largely formed by the stories we tell about ourselves, and how we can change when and if those stories change. But I learned something else from writing this book. I've been a journalist for 35 years, and from my days writing for student newspapers through 3 decades at Newsweek magazine, I had written hundreds of news stories. So I thought that writing a book wouldn't be that different. After a year, I had a 120,000-word draft that covered the vast sprawl of my family's history. It had lots of twists and turns and dramatic moments. And yet, when my agent sent it around to publishers, many of them said they found it flat, and they passed on it. Now, you can imagine the blow to the ego of somebody who had spent his career writing and editing the work of other writers. But what I came to realize was that my journalist's sense of what a story was covered only one dimension of what I call deep storytelling, essentially the plot, what happened. When I went back to study the works of memoir and narrative that I admired for guidance, I realized that what gave them their richness wasn't just what happened, but the other elements of storytelling. The first is character. How does a story conjure up the people in the story in a way that makes you really care about them? The second is what I call place. How vividly does it depict the setting and convey its impact on the characters and the action? And the third and most important is voice. Who's telling the story? What's their backstory and point of view? And how does that voice draw you in and make you want to keep listening? Now, of course, none of this is news to fiction writers. But in journalism, these other aspects of storytelling have often been downplayed or even outright dismissed. Talking too much about character is viewed as sort of psychobabble. Spending too much time on place for slowing down the story. Voice for being self-indulgent. But take it from me, it was only when I spent an entire year rewriting the whole book to bring out those aspects that I ended up with a story that kept people turning the pages. Now, why am I bringing this up in a conference devoted to what students should know to prepare themselves for the world of tomorrow? After all, my subject is one of the oldest ones in the book, going all the way to the Bible and Homer. There's Homer. Wait a second, there's Homer. And it's not as if there aren't many professions today that pay lip service to the importance of storytelling. Journalism, obviously, but also advertising and public relations, corporate marketing, political consulting, environmental and other forms of activism, the clergy. At work and at play, social media, from Facebook to Instagram to Twitter, has also given us all kinds of new tools to tell stories and the ability to each be our own publisher and broadcaster. Yet where will the students of today learn the difference between a good story and a great story? Where will they learn to know whether the story that they're reading or writing or producing is operating in only one or two of those dimensions, and when it becomes a multidimensional symphony that has the ability to transport and transform? In literature and history classes, perhaps, but not necessarily. In a creative writing course, if they have the courage to take one, maybe, but even that's not a sure thing. For nowhere is it required that students learn the art of deep storytelling. They have to be lucky to come across special teachers or elders or peers or books or movies or even television shows that help unlock its secrets. But it still matters. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the more fragmented and attention deficient the rest of our world becomes, the more we appreciate and crave deeply told stories. Take journalism, for example. At a time when newspapers, with their just the facts mantra of who, where, what, when, and how, are dying, and ratings for breaking news on television are plummeting, what was the most successful new journalistic offering of the last year? An old-fashioned radio program. Returning to the scene of a murder of a high school student in Baltimore 15 years ago, public radio producer Sarah Koenig spent hours delving not just into the details of the crime and the trial, but the personalities involved and the community in which it took place. She also made her own voice as a curious, skeptical, and sometimes confused narrator part of the story. By the time she was finished, millions of people were hooked on Serial. Some people say that the other professional world that I now inhabit, book publishing, is also dying. But what are some of the best-selling books on the market today, beyond the many shades of 50 Shades of Grey? Serious works of history and biography written by authors who also happen to be great storytellers. Authors such as David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin, Laura Hillenbrand, and Eric Larson. My kids, who are now in their 20s, work in television. And what are the hottest properties in that world right now? Deep stories with rich atmosphere and psychologically complex characters, like Mad Men and Breaking Bad, Downton Abbey, House of Cards, Transparent, and others. But here's another secret that young people should know about deep storytelling. The chances are that the more immersive and inevitable a story seems, the harder it was to produce. Laura Hillenbrand, the author of Seabiscuit and Unbroken, the amazing story of World War II pilot Louis Zamperini, suffers from severe chronic fatigue syndrome that makes it hard for her to even leave her house. And yet, partly because of her disability, she's developed the patience to spend years conducting long phone interviews, poring through old newspapers, and reconstructing the minutest details of the world that she recreates. Even with several bestsellers already under his belt, Eric Larson says he wrote 8 separate drafts of his latest book on the sinking of the Lusitania. Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, had spent a decade thinking about the characters and the plot lines and the distinctive setting and voice and style of that show before the AMC channel finally gave him a chance to make it, and so forth. Like a lot of journalists, I used to be a complete creature of deadline. From my days at George School, I was always good at cramming. I could bone up on a subject at the last minute and crash copy that made me sound like an expert. But unless you're Charles Dickens, you're not going to be able to work that way and produce great stories. Good stories maybe, but not great stories. For most mortals, producing a great story, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, requires deep digging and long reflection and the willingness to make false starts and go down dead-end roads. It demands not just legwork, but what the Germans call Sitzfleisch, the ability to keep your butt in a chair and write and rewrite and revise yet again. And when you're done, you're still going to be haunted by all the ways in which it could have been better. But if you can get through it, there's a chance that you may produce a story that leaves others and you with more than just a fleeting sense of satisfaction. On that note, I'll end with one final story, really an anecdote, really. This one's about my mother. There she is, celebrating her 88th birthday last year, near the retirement community where she lives, not far from here, south of Philadelphia. As I mentioned earlier, she's a retired professor of French literature. But when I visited her there recently, she had a confession to make. "I'm afraid I've become a news addict," she said. "What do you mean?" I said. She said, "Well, they had a lecture here about addiction, and the speaker mentioned news along with drugs and alcohol as something you can become addicted to." And I realized that that's what I've become, a news addict. When I moved here, I brought all of my favorite French and English novels and plays, but all I do is sit in front of the TV watching the news all day. My mother sighed. But I've decided, she said, that I'm going to spend more time rereading those books, because I think I'm going to get more out of them than just sitting there listening to all of these panel discussions of the same news headlines over and over again all day. But first I heard this and I thought, gee, Mom, thanks a lot. After all, in my career as a journalist, it used to be my job to get people hooked on the news. But yet again, I've come to realize that she's right. For the news or any other form of communication to matter, it's not just enough that it grab our attention or even that it keep us tuned in. It has to resonate and linger. It has to make us think and make us feel. And that's where deep storytelling comes in. So when we talk about what kids today should know for the future, let's by all means talk about things like big data and ubiquitous computing and global economics. But let's also talk about the ancient art of storytelling. And let's hope that when they reach my age or my mom's age, if they should be so lucky, that they can look back at the deeply told stories that helped change the way they saw themselves and the world. And then let's hope that they pass on that story to the next generation.